Hi, my name is Corey Dolgan. I'm a professor of sociology at Stonehill College. I want to thank the organizers of this conference and the participants for this session. Antonio Alejo from the University of A Coruña in Spain, Camila Macedo Ponte from the University of Geneva, Patricia Ferreira de Sousa Lima from the Federal Center for Technological Education of Rio, Elisa Privatera, the University of Catania, and Noah Seichman from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I especially want to thank my co-conspirator and partner in crime, Eberhard Raethelhuber, who puts up with more from me, or usually less from me than he deserves. I like to think that I am the idea guy and Ebby keeps our trains on the rails. But truth is, they are mostly his ideas too. Really, I'm just a pretty face. I want to start with a short introduction to the title, and the subject that brings us together, from the global to the grassroots, begins within the context of global decolonization efforts in knowledge production, political organization, and even in civil society in general, in some places, to some degree. While we hope this is not a quixotic journey, the challenges are many on both local and global scales. Sorry. In my own country, efforts to decolonize education have been met with virulent movements to ban the teaching of critical race theory, outlaw any mention of sexual orientation or gender identities, and degrade increased efforts at educational equity, claiming they dilute academic rigor and excellence. And of course, this week, my nation is witnessing the degradation of women's rights to pre-1960s era conditions. It seems impossible not to see this current convergence of serious decolonization and rising fascism, all amidst the planet's persistent rising temperature, as a true historical moment of crisis, as represented by the Chinese ideograph, one part danger, one part opportunity. In my own community, during the heat of a recent local school board election that pit two progressive women of color against two conservative white candidates, images and slogans of white nationalism and fascism reared their head. Local conservatives have been critical of diversity efforts in the public schools and made spurious claims about an elementary school librarian trying to groom young people by making available books about sexual orientation. But right before the election, hundreds of flyers appeared in various neighborhoods that proclaimed white guilt is child abuse. And this picture on the right of the white baby and the declaration innocent across its cap. It does not take long to look around on the notwhiteguilt.org website to see how a flyer dropped on the streets of Milton, Massachusetts is directly tied to the global identitarian movement. While we engage with these political battles across the street and around the globe, we are also faced with more practical, institutional, intellectual, and political dilemmas about what decolonization actually means and how it should influence our theory, methods, practice, and activism, our praxis. In other words, while efforts to decolonize have become more commonplace in university-based intellectual production, are we really making fundamental changes in settler colonial institutions if we simply add W.E.B. Du Bois and other international scholars of color to a newly diversified canon? How might we challenge not only the theoretical and disciplinary protocols of our research and teaching, but also consider dismantling the hegemonic role of elite institutions themselves? As M. Anwar Hassan argues in a recent article from the journal Critical Sociology, the contemporary model for social science research and production in Bangladesh is still shaped by and steeped in colonial foundations of knowledge production, research questioning, and research design, and protecting elite and racist conceptions of objectivity and neutrality. And none of those approaches can develop the knowledge or support the movements necessary to address the country's food security and climate change issues. A more comprehensive examination of the colonial roots of contemporary sociology, and I believe the same could be said of most social sciences, suggests the outright complicity of scholars and researchers in the colonial project itself. George Steinmetz made clear this connection between sociology and colonial objectives in an excellent article called Sociology and Colonialism in British and French Empires, 1945 to 1965. He writes, scientists, engineers, and technicians were in many respects the emblematic colonial actors of the mid-20th century empires. Between 1946 and 1952, more than 24 research institutes supporting social science were created across the colonial empire. The post-war shift from traditional forms of colonialism to a modernist development strategy for maintaining colonial power and influence, despite the changing face and identity of political governments and administrators, needed expert knowledge producers to, as one French agency explained, create the scientific infrastructure necessary for the industrial and economic development of overseas France. Sociology, they continued, orients itself above all toward the study of the current evolution of material, social, cultural, and ideological life. It could not be otherwise, since our contact with indigenous societies everywhere sets them on the path of accelerated change, severe problems, and anarchic reconstruction. The sociologist is typically the present-day observer and the advisor for the future in these regions. Sociological studies are indispensable for the local governments of the French Empire. At a historical moment of crisis for colonialism and imperialism, sociologists, in most cases, found themselves on what Camus called the side of pestilence. While sociologists became increasingly entrenched in the modern colonial project, colonial sociology became increasingly determinative of the sociological discipline itself, writ large. Similar to the ways that the Chicago school's modernist bias towards white supremacy and capitalist ideology characterized the early development of sociological hegemony, the post-war move towards quantitative research, demography, and development coincides with the colonial sociology's influence on higher education and national and international research-based agencies. From industrial development and community studies to the crises of spatial resettlement, research studies, methodological innovations, and theoretical interventions all moved from the sociological research in the colonies to the classrooms and textbooks of the colonizers. As Steinmetz admits, some even offered direct advice as well as research and analysis to colonial governments themselves. The concurrent domination of functionalist and modernization theories only further solidified the legitimacy of such political and ideological hegemony. But not all sociologists demonstrated open complicity or allegiance to colonial oppression. Steinmetz cites a few examples of sociologists such as André Michael and Claudine Chalet, who worked directly with the Algerian resistance, as did Frantz Fanon, who I will mention later. The alignment, engagement, or membership of sociologists with groups of oppressed people undoubtedly changed the nature of their research and analysis. Working with Algerian sociologist Abdelmark Sayad undoubtedly influenced Pierre Bourdieu's work on forced resettlement and regrouping plans in the French colonies. Together, they argued that these policies demonstrated a pathological response to the mortal crisis of the colonial system, laying bare the pathological aims at the core of the colonial system and leading to a pathological acceleration of cultural change. Their work was banned from printing by the French government, only to be published after Algerian independence. I believe we are at a similar historical juncture where the notion of decolonization intellectually and theoretically holds great promise. But in the face of fascism, both the current virulent strains of the Putin, Modi, Erdogan, Trump nexus to the alternative, kinder, gentler neoliberal brand that prefaced their rise, We must draw our politically engaged praxis roots from an alternative history of social science that has always aligned and embedded itself with revolutionary movements and commitments. From Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral to C.L.R. James and Ida B. Wells, from Paulo Freire and Orlando Fals Borda to Maurice Bishop and Marielle Franco. There is a rich tradition of revolutionary social scientists who were integral in producing and articulating revolutionary knowledge as part of liberation struggles. But let me conclude this introductory piece by also suggesting that in order to challenge the powerful foundations of structural colonialism, its component white supremacy, patriarchy, and corporate power, we need to reimagine and reconstruct the way we produce what Cox and Fominaya call movement knowledge. And while this information from below entails publicly communicating facts and experiences uncomfortable to structures of power, such as the practices of torture and extrajudicial executions, the effects of individual pollutants and the costs of global warming, levels of rape and sexual abuse, the facts of poverty and exploitation, caste oppression and racism, the list is long. On a larger scale, radical movements knowledge must highlight new ways of seeing the world in terms of class or patriarchy, of colonization or neoliberalism, of ecology and human rights. What roles might we play as committed revolutionary social scientists in our own communities or chosen locations, and how might that work contribute to a larger movement knowledge and action are the questions we must ask. And so as Abby and I conceived the thematic description for this session, we emphasize the practice and challenges of building the kinds of collaborative and democratic relationships that will envision new ways of organizing knowledge production and challenging the institutions that sanction oppressive economic systems, political discourse, and cultural values. We wrote, participatory and community-based forms of social problem analysis are core elements of empowerment and change from below, around the globe. For example, community development, participatory action research, or PAR, and popular education entail particular methodologies for and orientation towards producing grounded knowledge and encouraging community building and social action. Such processes have proven effective in fighting social inequalities and finding useful and sustainable solutions towards social change. Yet there is little transnational and intersectoral exchange on capacity building for research and the practical ways of doing participatory analysis across social movements, academic projects, organizing efforts, and civic engagement. A project that Abby and I have been working on is based on a strategy that develops workshops for radical participatory action research that foregrounds democratic, political, and social principles, values, and process while maintaining reflection and engagement with global dynamics, movements, and conditions. But before I get into the details of that project, I want to suggest that there are alternative traditions for PAR or engaged and embedded and democratic collaborative knowledge production for us to draw on as we consider various methods and strategies for doing the work of decolonization and revolution. In the United States, PAR has all too often been part of the neoliberalization of collaborative knowledge production, too often under the direction of expertise for the sake of liberal democracy and capitalist efficiency. From the work of Kurt Lewin and William F. White to the contemporary civic engagement movement characterized by unsophisticated theories of reciprocity and service learning, a more critical PAR as revolutionary, not neoliberal, has been lacking. To look at revolutionary work of engaged research and action often requires a different non-academic lens. And so I would propose that if we look at work from England or the US, we focus on the roots of cultural studies in England, workers' education programs after World War II that produced cultural studies, not so much the institutional formation and field of theoretical study and ideological critique that it became. Or we look at the US tradition of workers and community schools led by Miles Horton and the Brookwood Labor College led by A.J. Musty, to more contemporary efforts to integrate union and civil rights organizing in the South and multicultural working class organizing in Los Angeles through the Labor Community Strategy Center or Project South in Atlanta. Even better for us to look at the anti-colonial popular education work of Cabral and Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o throughout Africa, or Che Guevara, Orlando Falls Borda, Paulo Freire, and the persistence of the Zapatista movement in Latin America. The key to all of these traditions was the integration and alignment of educators and artists and communities who recognized the need to challenge elite knowledge stratification and class positions at the same time as people produced research and strategy collectively and collaboratively for political action. At Waldhüttel in Innsbruck, Austria, Ebby and I are on our second year of conducting PAR summer research camps. Waldhüttel itself is a grassroots community center set on multiple acres of farm and retreat facilities that welcomes people from all walks of life and gives shelter to those in need, independent of their origin, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. There, we bring together early career scholars and advanced graduate students who are hoping to integrate PAR into their work or share their experiences already conducting PAR-related research. We are also open to educators and community practitioners and activists who recognize PAR as a method of organizing and mobilizing movement knowledge for social change. And we also engage with Roma migrant workers and musicians who live at Waldhüttel full or part-time, as well as those who work and operate the center. While we discuss the nuts and bolts of actual PAR methodologies, we focus on the necessary process of relation building and collective and personal reflection in developing collaborative inquiry and action. In Stoker and Falcone's new handbook for participatory action research and community development, contributor Jose Wellington Sousa concludes his piece entitled Relationship as Resistance by suggesting that Freire's conception of partnership lost its richness and radical nature in English translation. He writes, compañerismo implies a partnership whereby affection and political solidarity do not lose each other. Relationships are as intrinsic to human existence as much as praxis. He concludes by linking compañerismo to Falls Borda concept of the vivencia as an invitation for academics and community members to live with and experience life with one another as an ontological given and the basis for consciousness and transformative action. This approach becomes both a way of being in the world and a methodology. Thus, he concludes, for academics, such work means resisting the academic political economy and being committed to the humanization of both themselves and community members. In resisting through relationships, we can create possibilities for the de-alienation of the self and the de-alienation from one another, which is the basis for subject-to-subject relationships, whether in the global north, the global south, or in between. We hope our work at the camp and our conversations here and elsewhere can further such ideas and practices. Thank you.